The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Inez Crawford buried the last piece of herself she had sworn to protect. She did not open it. She never opened them. She had not opened a single one of the 11 letters Isaiah Ellsworth had sent across the 600 miles of dust and heartbreak that separated Caldwell, Kansas from the small, sunburned town of Redemption, Texas. She had sent every one of them back unopened, sealed tight, sometimes with a single line written on the outside of the envelope in her sharp, precise handwriting. Words like, "Do not write again," or "There is nothing between us." Or simply, on the third letter, his name written in full, Isaiah Ellsworth, as if she were identifying a body. She stacked this one on top of the others she had kept in a tin box beneath her bed, meaning to send it back in the morning when she could get to the post office before noon. But she did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow mattress in the boarding house room that smelled of cedar and old candle wax, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the last time she had seen his face. She thought about the way he had looked standing at the edge of the rail platform in Caldwell, his hat in both hands, his jaw tight, his dark eyes following the train she was already boarding. She thought about how she had not turned back to look at him, had kept her spine rigid and her chin forward, and how in the 6 months since, she had replicated that posture so many times it had started to feel like armor rather than grief. She got up at 2 in the morning, crossed the cold floorboards barefoot, and pulled the tin box from beneath the bed. She opened it. She counted 12 letters, all still sealed. She pressed her palm flat against the stack of them and closed her eyes, and for a moment she let herself feel what she had been forbidding herself to feel, which was the full, brutal weight of missing him. Then she opened the most recent one, and Inez Crawford wept. She wept in the way that women weep when they have held everything back for so long that the release of it is almost violent, when the tears do not fall so much as escape, when the sound that comes out of a person is less crying and more the sound of something fundamental giving way. She pressed the letter against her chest and she rocked forward slightly over the edge of the bed, and she cried until her ribs hurt and her eyes swelled and the candle she had lit had burned itself down to a stub. Then she read it again. She read it 3 times before the sun came up, and when the sun did come up, Inez Crawford made a decision that changed everything. But to understand the decision, you have to understand the letters. And to understand the letters, you have to understand what happened in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, when Inez Crawford and Isaiah Ellsworth first met under circumstances that neither of them had chosen, and both of them had survived in ways that left marks the eye could not see. Caldwell was a cattle town, which meant it was loud and transient and full of men who were passing through, which also meant it was the kind of town where a woman of 24 with strong opinions and a modest inheritance from a father who had been a schoolteacher in Ohio could open a small dress shop and earn something close to an independent life. Inez had done exactly that. She had arrived in Caldwell in the autumn of 1881 with 2 trunks, a sewing machine, and a determination so total it had frightened the woman at the boarding house who showed her the room. "You are awful certain for someone who has never run a business," the woman had said. "I have never run a business because no one has given me the opportunity," Inez had replied. "That is a different thing entirely." She had opened Crawford's dress and tailoring in November of 1881, in a narrow storefront between a hardware supplier and a pharmacy, and she had spent the winter building a reputation for clean seams and honest prices. By April of 1882, she had 4 regular clients and was beginning to believe that the terrifying gamble of leaving Ohio had been the correct one. That was when the man with the dark eyes and the reputation he was trying to outrun came to Caldwell. Isaiah Ellsworth was 28 years old and had spent the previous 4 years working cattle drives along the Kisham Trail, which meant he had seen more sky and more violence than most men accumulate in a lifetime. He was not a drifter by temperament but by circumstance, having left his family's farm in Missouri at 22 after a falling out with his father that both men were too stubborn to resolve, and having found in the open country of the cattle trails a kind of freedom that was also a kind of exile. He was lean and dark-haired, and had the kind of face that was too serious to be called handsome at first glance, but revealed itself, over time and in the right light, to be something considerably better than handsome. He was also, beneath the exterior that 3 years of trail work had hardened, the kind of man who read books when he could get them and thought carefully before he spoke and believed, in a way he had never said aloud to anyone, that there was a version of his life that was better than the one he was currently living. He had come to Caldwell meaning to stay one night. He had needed a shirt, mended the collar had torn during a river crossing near the Red River, and someone at the saloon had told him the woman at the dress shop on Main Street was skilled and fair. He had gone the next morning when the shop was barely open, hat in hand, and had found Inez Crawford standing behind her counter with a measuring tape around her neck and an expression of professional assessment that made it clear she was deciding, before he had said a single word, whether or not he was worth her time. "I need this collar repaired," he said, laying the shirt on the counter. She picked it up and examined it without speaking. She turned it over, pressed the torn seam between her fingers, held it up to the light from the window. "This will be ready in 2 hours," she said. 30 cents. "That's reasonable," he said. "I know," she said. He came back in 2 hours and she handed him the shirt, and the repair was so clean it was nearly invisible, and he stood there in her shop holding it and looking at it longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked up at her and said, without really having planned to, "That is the finest mending I have seen in 4 years on the trail." "Then you have been going to the wrong shops," she said. "I have mostly been going to no shops," he said. She looked at him properly for the first time, which is to say she set down what she was doing and regarded him as a person rather than a transaction, and he did not look away when she did, which most people did when Inez looked at them with full attention. "Are you staying in Caldwell?" she asked. "I was planning one night," he said. "Possibly I will reconsider." He did reconsider. He stayed 4 days, which became 2 weeks, which became something that neither of them had planned or expected, but which grew up between them anyway, the way things grow in rocky soil, slowly, and with difficulty, but with roots that go deep. He came into the shop every morning on some pretense or another. A button loose on a vest, a hem on a pair of trousers. Once he came in with no pretense at all, just his hat in his hand and a look on his face that said he had run out of excuses and was here anyway, and she had looked at him over the top of the dress she was pinning and said, "I am not a socializing establishment, Mr. Ellsworth." And he had said, "No, ma'am, I know that. I thought I might sit here while you work if you have no objection." And she had said, after a pause that lasted long enough to be meaningful, "I suppose that depends on whether you are the sort of person who talks while I am concentrating." "I am not," he said. "Then sit," she said. He sat. He pulled a book from his coat pocket, a worn copy of Dickens, the spine cracked and soft from handling, and he read while she worked, and they sat together in the narrow shop with the morning light coming through the single front window and the sound of Main Street going on outside, and neither of them spoke for almost an hour, and it was one of the most unexpectedly comfortable hours Inez had passed since leaving Ohio. "What is the book?" she asked, finally. "Bleak House," he said. "I have read it," she said. "It is very long. Most worthwhile things are," he said. She looked up at him again, and he was looking back at her over the top of the book, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a trail-hardened cattle drover who had wandered into a dress shop. It was the expression of a man who was paying very close attention, and finding everything he was paying attention to remarkable. Inez was not a woman who was easily undone. She had built her independence on the principle of not being undone by things, including men, and particularly including men who looked at her as though she were something remarkable. She had seen enough of those looks by 24 to know they were rarely followed up by anything of substance. But Isaiah Ellsworth was patient in a way that was different from calculated. He did not press his advantage. He did not flatter her or make grand declarations. He simply continued to appear in her shop every morning with a book and a willingness to be quiet, and he offered his opinions only when asked, and he was honest when he gave them. And once, when a difficult customer came in and spoke to Inez with a condescension that made Isaiah's jaw tighten visibly, he said nothing until the customer left and then said only, "You handled that with more grace than I would have." And Inez had said, "I have had practice." And they had shared a look that was, though neither of them acknowledged it, a small and private act of solidarity. They had their first real conversation about something of consequence on a Thursday evening in May, when Inez had agreed to take supper with him at the hotel dining room. It was not a romantic dinner. It was a practical arrangement. She was hungry and it was late and he had asked, and she had seen no reasonable objection. But it became the kind of conversation that rearranges a person's interior landscape without warning. She told him about Ohio, about her father, who had been gentle and bookish and had believed education was the most democratic gift one could give a child, and who had taught her to read at 3 and to argue at 5 and to question everything at 7. She told him about her father dying when she was 20 of a cough that had started small and grown large, and about the modest inheritance that had arrived in the form of cash money and the instruction, in the will, that it be given to her outright with no restrictions and no conditions, which had been in 1881 an unusual thing for a man to do for a daughter. "He trusted you with it entirely," Isaiah said. "He trusted me with everything entirely," she said. "He always had. It was the greatest gift he gave me, that trust." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, "I was not trusted with much," and the simplicity of the statement, the total absence of self-pity in it, told her more about his history than any elaboration would have. "Tell me," she said. He did. He told her about the farm in Missouri and the father who was a good farmer and a poor man for affection, who believed that discipline and silence were the proper expressions of a parent's love, and who had raised 4 sons according to this philosophy, with results that had scattered those sons across the country as soon as each reached the age where scattering was possible. He told her about leaving at 22, about the first cattle drive, about the particular freedom and loneliness of the open range, about the way the sky in Texas was a different thing entirely from the sky in Missouri, bigger and more indifferent and somehow more honest for it. "Do you miss Missouri?" she asked. "I miss the version of Missouri that never quite existed," he said. "The one that would have been good to me." She understood that. She understood it precisely, because she had a version of Ohio she had left behind that was the same kind of fiction. The version in which her father had not died, and the life she had built there had been sufficient, and she had not needed to come to Kansas to find out who she was. They talked until the dining room was nearly empty, and the proprietor was extinguishing the lamps at the far end of the room. Walking back from the hotel, in the warm May dark with the street quiet around them and the sound of the saloon down the block muffled by distance, Isaiah stopped on the boardwalk outside her shop and said her name. Inez, not Miss Crawford. Just Inez, the way people say a name when they have been wanting to say it plainly for some time. She stopped and looked at him. "I am aware," he said, "that I have been coming into your shop on pretenses that have grown increasingly thin. The loose button on your second vest was particularly unconvincing," she said. "I moved it myself," he admitted. "The night before. Something in her chest did a complicated thing that she chose not to examine too closely." "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I think you deserve the truth about what I am doing here," he said. "Which is that I came to Caldwell planning to stay one night and have been unable to leave because of you. And I am aware that is a great deal to say to someone who has not given you permission to say it. But I would rather say it and have you tell me to stop than not say it and leave without you knowing." The night was warm and smelled of dust and prairie grass, and the stars over Caldwell were spectacular in the way they always were out here, far from any city's light pollution. Inez looked at Isaiah Ellsworth standing on the boardwalk with his hat in his hand, and his dark eyes entirely honest, and she thought about all the careful walls she had built, and all the reasons she had built them, and she said, "I have not told you to stop." What grew between them over the following weeks was extraordinary precisely because it was not reckless. They were both people who had been formed by loss and who carried a natural wariness about anything that looked too good, and so they moved carefully and with the kind of mutual respect that is rarer than passion but more durable. He walked her home in the evenings. She lent him books. They argued about Dickens and about the cattle industry, and about the question of whether Caldwell had a future or was simply passing through its own brief moment before the railroads changed everything. And their arguments were the best kind, the kind where both people are genuinely thinking and listening, and willing to change their positions when presented with new information. He kissed her for the first time on the 20th of June, on the back steps of her shop after she had locked up for the evening, in the long golden light of a prairie sunset. It was unhurried and sure, and she kissed him back with her hands pressed flat against the lapels of his jacket and her eyes closed, and when they broke apart she said nothing, because nothing was needed, and he said nothing, because he understood that too. "I have been thinking about staying in Caldwell," he said after a moment. She looked at him steadily. "That would require work," she said. "A man cannot simply inhabit a cattle town without employment." "I have been speaking to a man about a position at the stockyards," he said. "Managing the livestock records. It is not trail work. It is steady, and it keeps me in one place." "In one place," she repeated, and the words meant more than they appeared to. "In this place," he said, "if there is reason." She let her hands fall from his lapel slowly. "There is reason," she said. "Things were good through July. They were very good, actually, in the way that is both wonderful and frightening, the way that makes a person who has learned to protect herself feel exposed and uncertain even in the middle of happiness. Isaiah was settled and present and attentive without being suffocating. He brought her wildflowers from the edge of town, not because he had read in some book that women liked flowers, but because he had seen her pause and admire a patch of them on a walk one afternoon and had remembered. He fixed the hinge on her shop door that had been stiff all spring, without being asked. He remembered what she said and referred back to it in later conversations, which was the act, she thought, of a man who was genuinely listening and not simply waiting for his turn to speak. She began to believe, cautiously, that this was real, that this particular version of a thing could hold. And then the dark past she had not told him about arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon in August with a saddlebag full of secrets and a set of demands that put everything at risk. His name was Fletcher Holt. He was 35 years old and had the look of a man who had been handsome once and had spent the intervening years using up that capital carelessly. He had been the business partner of Inez's father in Ohio, a fact she had known and had been hoping was distant enough, in miles if not in time, to remain buried. But debts of a certain kind travel, and Fletcher Holt had found out where Inez had gone, and he had come to collect on what he believed was owed. The debt was not hers. It was complicated, and it was ugly, and it involved her father's final business dealings, and a contract that Holt claimed gave him legal claim to a portion of the inheritance Inez had used to start her shop. He came into Crawford's dress and tailoring on a Wednesday afternoon when she was alone, and he laid papers on her counter that she had never seen before, and he smiled at her the way he had always smiled, which was the smile of a man who knows something about power and enjoys deploying it. "You have no legal right to anything of mine," she told him, keeping her voice steady with an effort that cost her significantly. "My father's estate was settled. The inheritance was mine outright." "There is a prior agreement that your father's solicitor apparently failed to disclose," Holt said, tapping the papers, "which creates complications for you, Miss Crawford, unless, of course, we can come to an arrangement." "What arrangement?" she said flatly. He told her. The arrangement was not one she was willing to make. It involved her returning to Ohio with him, under circumstances she understood immediately and rejected completely. She understood from the look in his eyes and the tone of his voice, was not a request. She told him to leave. He told her she had until the end of the week to make her decision. He left. She spent 2 days in a private agony of fear and fury and calculation, trying to determine what her options were without involving Isaiah. She did not want to involve Isaiah. This was her burden, her dark past, her problem to solve, and she did not want to bring him into it for 2 reasons. First, because she had built her life on handling her own affairs, and second, because she was afraid of what would happen if she let someone in that far. Let someone see the hidden motive of every choice she had made, the secret she carried, that she was not as strong as she appeared, that there were people from her past who could hurt her still. But Isaiah had noticed. He noticed everything. On Friday evening he came to walk her home, and she was pale and brittle in a way that was not her. And when he asked her what was wrong, she said nothing was wrong, and he looked at her for a long, quiet moment and said, "Inez, I know you. Something is wrong." She told him. She had expected, she did not know exactly what she had expected. Perhaps for him to insist on handling it himself in some way that bypassed her. Perhaps for the fear in his eyes to make her feel like a burden. She had not expected what actually happened, which was that he listened to everything she said without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "What do you want to do?" Not, "Let me handle it." Not, "I will go talk to this man," but, "What do you want to do?" She felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite love but was adjacent to both. "I want him to have no legal claim," she said. "I want documentation that the inheritance was mine, free and clear. I want him to leave Caldwell." "Then let us find out whether those papers he showed you are legitimate," Isaiah said. "There is a lawyer in Caldwell named Drummond who handles cattle contract disputes. He would know if what Holt showed you holds any legal weight." They went to Drummond together the next morning. Drummond examined the papers Inez had made Holt leave with her. She had insisted on keeping them, which had surprised Holt and annoyed him, which was precisely why she had done it. And Drummond spent 20 minutes looking them over with his reading glasses on his nose and his brow furrowed, and then he set them down and said, "These are fraudulent. Not well done, either. The notarization seal on the second page is from a county in Ohio that I happen to know ceased to operate in 1878. Whatever this man is, he is not a lawyer." The relief was so profound that Inez had to grip the arm of the chair she was sitting in. "He is a confidence man," she said. "He was always a confidence man. My father trusted him and I suspected him, and I was right." They had confronted Holt that afternoon. Or rather, Inez had confronted Holt, and Isaiah had stood 2 feet behind her left shoulder in the lobby of the hotel where Holt was staying, not speaking, not threatening, simply present in a way that made clear without a single word that the situation was not what Holt had calculated it to be. Inez had laid the fraudulent papers on the front desk and told Holt, in a voice that did not shake even slightly, exactly what Drummond had found. And she had told him that if he remained in Caldwell past the following morning, she would ensure that the sheriff received both the papers and Drummond's assessment of them. Holt had looked at her and then at Isaiah and then back at her, and the smile had gone, and what replaced it was an ugly thing, the look of a man who has found that his trap has failed and is trying to calculate whether there is another one available. There was not. He left Caldwell the next morning. Inez stood in her shop that afternoon and felt the adrenaline leaving her body slowly, like a tide going out, and she felt something that was close to trembling but that she controlled by pressing her hands flat on the counter. She was thinking about how close it had been. Not legally, Drummond had been confident the papers were worthless, but emotionally. She had been close, in those 2 days before she told Isaiah, to bolting. To packing her trunks and going somewhere else entirely, starting over again, avoiding the risk of someone knowing her vulnerabilities. She was still standing there thinking this when Isaiah came in. He did not say anything about Holt. Looked at her across the shop and said, "Are you all right?" "I am thinking about something," she said. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "about the fact that you asked me what I wanted to do. That first evening when I told you about Holt, you asked what I wanted, not what you planned to do about it." "It was your situation," he said simply. "Most men would not have seen it that way," she said. "I am not most men," he said without arrogance, simply as a fact. "No," she said, "you are not." She looked at him standing in the doorway of her shop in the August afternoon light, and she thought about what she had been risking without knowing she was risking it, and she thought about his dark eyes finding hers in every room they were in together, and she thought about the 23rd of June on the back steps, and about books left on her counter, and about a man who had moved a button on his own vest in order to have a reason to see her. She stepped out from behind the counter and crossed the shop toward him, and she kissed him with the full force of someone who has stopped calculating and started simply feeling, and he wrapped both arms around her and kissed her back with the same total honesty that characterized everything else he did. And when they broke apart, he was not smiling exactly, but there was something in his face that was better than a smile. "I have been thinking about asking you something," he said. She waited. "I would like to know whether this, what is between us, is the kind of thing that leads somewhere permanent," he said. "I am not asking for an answer today. I am asking you to think about it." She put her hand against his jaw. "I am already thinking about it," she said. August became September and September became October, and what had been growing between them became something that felt, to both of them, like a foundation rather than a feeling solid, load-bearing, built to last. He talked to her about Missouri, about his brothers, about the father who was still alive somewhere in the Ozarks, about the unresolved grief of that estrangement. She talked to him about Ohio, about her father, about the loneliness of being a self-sufficient woman in a world that rewarded self-sufficiency in men and found it inconvenient in women. They talked about the future in a way that was specific and real, not the vague, dreamy future of early romance, but the practical, considered future of two people who are actually planning to share one. He mentioned land. She mentioned expansion. They discussed whether Caldwell was the right town long-term, or whether the changing patterns of the cattle trade would move the center of commerce south over the next decade. He proposed to her on the first Sunday in November, at the edge of town, where a stand of cottonwood trees dropped their yellow leaves in the cold November wind, with a ring that had been his grandmother's, sent to him by his youngest brother in a letter he had written specifically to ask for it. She said yes without hesitation, and with the tears she had not cried since her father died, and he held her against his chest in the cold wind under the yellow cottonwood trees, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, that the future was not something to be afraid of. And then everything broke. The breaking was not dramatic. That was the terrible thing about it. It was not a single catastrophic event, but a series of smaller fractures that accumulated damage. In December, a letter arrived from Missouri. Isaiah's father was ill. The letter was from his brother James, who was the most responsible of the four boys and who had stayed on the farm, and who used the word serious twice in the same short paragraph, which told Isaiah everything he needed to know about the prognosis. He went to Inez and told her, and she saw in his face the collision of old pain and new duty, the forced choice that he had not asked for and could not avoid. "You need to go," she said. "The farm," he said. "If my father dies, James cannot manage alone. There is the question of what happens to the property, to the family situation. I would need to stay, potentially for some time." "I understand," she said. "I am not abandoning what we have," he said. "I need you to understand that. This is not Isaiah," she said. "I know. Go." He left in January of 1883. He said he would write. He said he would send for her when the situation was resolved, when he understood what was required of him and could make a plan. He kissed her goodbye on the train platform in Caldwell with his hands holding her face and his forehead pressed against hers, and he said her name the way he always said it, plainly, like a fact, like the name of something he intended to keep. She watched the train leave, and then she walked back to her shop and she worked. The first letter came 3 weeks later, postmarked Bridgewater, Missouri. She looked at it for a long time. She did not open it. The truth the truth that she could not say aloud and could barely say to herself, was this: his departure had unlocked something in her that was not rational. She had stood on that platform and watched the train go, and she had felt, beneath the understanding and the love and the faith in him, a cold, sliding terror that she recognized from her deepest self. The terror of the person who had watched her father walk away one morning and had never, in any meaningful sense, gotten him back. The terror of the person who had learned, before she was old enough to have a word for it, that the people you love most are also the people most capable of leaving a wound in the shape of themselves behind. He had not left her. She knew he had not left her. His leaving was practical and necessary, and she had told him herself to go. But the feeling did not respond to logic, and the feeling said, he is gone. The feeling said, they always go. The feeling said, if you open the letter and read it and let him back in and then something happens, the father takes longer to die than expected, or the farm needs him for years, or Missouri calls him back to the person he was before you knew him, you will be destroyed by it. She sent the letter back unopened. She sent the next one back too, and the next. She told herself she was protecting herself. She told herself it was a necessary severance, a clean cut rather than a slow bleed. She told herself that if he had understood her at all, really understood her, he would have known she could not do distance, could not sustain herself on words through an envelope while managing a shop and a life alone in a cattle town. She did not let herself think about what he was feeling. In April she sold the shop. The terms of the cattle trade had shifted significantly, and Caldwell's boom period was contracting, just as she had predicted in their long conversations about it. And she moved to Redemption, Texas, which was smaller and quieter and had no stockyards and therefore no connection to anything that reminded her of him. She rented a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Garfield, and she set up a smaller tailoring operation, and she made herself a life that was sufficient if not full. She felt him at the edges of it all the time, not in the way of haunting but in the way of absence, the particular negative space that a specific person leaves when they are missing from your daily landscape. She noticed it in the mornings when she sat with her coffee and there was no book on the other side of the table, no large, quiet presence reading Dickens. She noticed it in the evenings when something interesting happened, and her first instinct was to turn and tell someone, and the someone was not there. She noticed it when she saw a man standing at the edge of a paddock watching horses with that particular combination of patience and appreciation that she associated with him, and she would catch her breath until the man turned and revealed himself to be someone entirely other. She kept sending the letters back. 9, 10, 11. Each one a small, deliberate act of self-preservation that she was beginning, around letter 8, to suspect was actually something different, a trap she had built for herself. A dark past of a different kind, not the dark past of something that had happened to her, but the dark past of something she was doing to herself. And then the 12th letter arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1883. She opened it. She wept. She read it again. She read it a third time. The letter was 4 pages long, in his handwriting which she recognized the way you recognize a piece of music you love, the particular slant and deliberateness of it, the economy of his language even in something this emotionally exposed. He wrote that his father had died in February. He wrote that he had stayed through March and April to help James settle the estate and arrange the farm, and that it had been complicated in the way that all family grief is complicated, full of unresolved things and old silences, and the terrible sadness of people who wanted to speak to each other, but had lost the habit of doing so. He wrote that when he finally returned to Caldwell in May and found the shop closed and Inez gone and no forwarding address left at the post office, he had felt something that he would not precisely describe, but that he said had lasted for some weeks. He had found her eventually through Mrs. Garfield's boarding house, which had been listed in a traveler's directory he had found at the Caldwell post office, Inez having arranged to have any forwarded mail sent there before she left. He had sent letters to Redemption, and she had sent them back, and he had sent more, and she had sent those back too. He wrote, "I have not known what the letters returned meant. I have spent months trying to decide. I have tried to decide if you changed your mind about me, about us, about everything we said and planned together. I have tried to decide if I did something, said something, failed you in some way I cannot identify. I have told myself many things in the months since I came back to an empty shop in Caldwell. I have told myself you were right to go. I have told myself that what I offered you was not enough, that distance and grief and a family situation I had no control over was a reasonable reason for you to choose differently. I have told myself all of this, and none of it has convinced me." He wrote, "I am going to tell you one true thing, which is the truest thing I know about myself, and then I am going to stop writing, because I understand that if you send this one back I will not write again. The true thing is this: I have loved you since before I knew the word for it. I loved you on the fourth morning I sat in your shop with my book, and you argued with me about whether Dickens was too sentimental, and you were brilliant and certain and completely right about it. I loved you when you stood in a hotel lobby in Caldwell with fraudulent papers under your arm and told a confidence man to get out of your life, and you did not shake once, not even slightly. I loved you on the November day you said yes under the cottonwood trees, and I loved you at the train station in January, and I have loved you every day through every silence and every letter returned unopened, and I am not telling you this to make a demand. I have no right to make demands of you. I am telling you this because you deserve to know it, the same way I once told you I was coming into your shop on pretenses because you deserved the truth." He wrote, "I am in Redemption, Texas. I have been here for 3 days. I am staying at the Miller Hotel, which is the only hotel in town. I am not here to force anything. I am here because I needed to see this town, see the place where you are, even if you never know I was here. I will leave after one more day if I do not hear from you. I will understand that hearing nothing means something, and I will honor it." He wrote, "I am sorry for everything that the last year has cost you. I am sorry for leaving, even though I do not know what else I could have done. I am sorry for not finding you sooner when I came back. I am sorry if I made you feel at any point that you were a temporary thing in my life rather than the reason I would very much like to stay in one place." He wrote at the bottom of the 4th page simply, "Inez, I am here." She read it 4 times in the early morning hours with the candle burning low, and the 4th time she was already getting up, already reaching for her clothes, because it was not yet 5 in the morning, but the Miller Hotel was 4 blocks away, and she had stopped letting herself be afraid sometime during the 3rd reading. She walked those 4 blocks in the dark with the October air cold on her face and the town absolutely silent around her, and she knocked on the door of the Miller Hotel, which was answered by a very tired desk clerk who looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to be dealing with a woman at 4:50 in the morning. "Isaiah Ellsworth," she said. "What room?" The clerk looked at her for a moment and then evidently decided that the determination in her face was not something he was equipped to argue with at 4:50 in the morning. "Room 7, he said. "2nd floor." She took the stairs 2 at a time. She knocked on the door of room 7. There was a long silence and then the sound of movement, and then the door opened, and Isaiah Ellsworth stood in the doorway of room 7 of the Miller Hotel in Redemption, Texas, in his shirt sleeves with sleep-rumpled hair and an expression that shifted from confused to awake to something she did not have a word for in the span of 2 seconds. "Inez," he said. She was still holding the letter. She held it up briefly, and then she said, "I read it," and her voice broke on the last word, which was the first time her voice had broken in front of another person since her father died, and she did not try to hold it together. He stepped forward and she stepped forward, and they were in each other's arms in the hallway with the letter pressed between them and her face against his shoulder and his arms completely around her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "All of them," she finally said, against the fabric of his shirt. "I should have read all of them. I am sorry." "I know why you did not," he said, his voice low against the top of her head. "I was afraid," she said. "That is the truth. I was afraid, and I was a coward about it." "You are the least cowardly person I know," he said. "About most things," she said. "Not about this." He held her tighter. "I know," he said. "I know the shape of that fear. I have it too. Different reasons, same fear." She lifted her head and looked at him in the dim hallway, at the dark eyes that had been looking at her with that particular honest attention since April of 1882 in a narrow dress shop in Caldwell, and she put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heart beating. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud, though she had known it for months. "I love you, and I am done sending things back." "Good," he said quietly. He put his hand over hers, pressed it flat against his heart. "Then I would like to ask you something I asked you once before, except this time I am asking it knowing exactly what we know about ourselves and each other, which is considerably more than we knew under the cottonwood trees." "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me," he said, "here, in Redemption, where you have made your life?" "Yes," she said. The same word as before, but different, heavier, and more certain. The yes of someone who has considered all the ways it might go wrong and is choosing it anyway, which is the only kind of yes that is really worth giving. They stood in the hallway of the Miller Hotel in Redemption, Texas, until the early morning light began to suggest itself through the window at the end of the corridor, and then Inez said, "I should go back to the boarding house before Mrs. Garfield decides I have been kidnapped." And he laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh in almost a year, and it was the most welcome sound she had thought possible. "Tomorrow," he said, walking her to the top of the stairs. "Have dinner with me tomorrow." "Tonight," she said. "I have already wasted enough time." He smiled at her, the full version of it, and it did what it always did, which was rearrange something in her interior landscape. "Tonight," he agreed. She walked back to the boarding house in the early morning light with the letter still in her hand, and she was not thinking about what had been lost in the year of silence. She was thinking about what came next. They were married in December of 1883, on the 14th, which was a Saturday. The ceremony was simple by design. Inez had no patience for ceremony for its own sake, conducted by the justice of the peace in the parlor of the Redemption Courthouse. There were 7 people present: Mrs. Garfield, who cried throughout; a woman named Clara Vasquez, who had become Inez's first real friend in Redemption, and who served as her witness; Isaiah's brother James, who had ridden down from Missouri for the occasion, and who shook Inez's hand afterward with the solemnity of a man who understood that his brother had found something worth coming to Texas for; the desk clerk from the Miller Hotel, whose name turned out to be Thomas, and who had apparently decided that anyone who knocked on his door at 5 in the morning for love deserved to see how the story came out; and 2 other townspeople who had wandered in from the street when the door was open. Inez wore a dress she had made herself, deep green wool with cream lace at the collar and cuffs, and she had her dark hair pinned up with a tortoiseshell comb that had been her mother's. Isaiah wore his best suit, which was not his best suit from the cattle-driving years, but a proper charcoal suit that he had acquired in anticipation of this occasion, and he stood beside her at the front of the parlor with his hands folded and his face quiet and intent. And when the justice of the peace asked him to repeat his vows, his voice did not waver once. They moved into a rented house on the east side of Redemption in January of 1884. A real house, not large, with a wooden porch that needed work and a yard with 2 pecan trees, and enough room for a garden if they wanted one. Isaiah had secured work with a local cattle broker named Martinez, who ran a legitimate and well-organized operation out of an office on the main street, and who needed someone to manage his accounts and oversee his records, which Isaiah did with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. Inez expanded her tailoring operation, taking on not just mending and alterations but original dressmaking, and within 6 months she had a small but loyal clientele that included the wives of several of Redemption's more prosperous families. They were happy. Not the anxious, provisional happiness of people who are waiting for disaster, but the real kind, the settled, daily kind that accumulates in small moments and quiet evenings, and the particular satisfaction of sharing a life with someone who sees you accurately and chooses you anyway. They argued sometimes because they were both people with opinions and neither was inclined to suppress them. But their arguments were honest, and their resolutions were genuine, and they never went to bed having left the important things unsaid. In the evenings they read together, the way they had first sat together in her shop in Caldwell, except that now the quiet was full rather than empty, the silence of two people who are comfortable in each other's company rather than two people who are still measuring the distance between them. He brought her wildflowers when he found them. She left bookmarks in books she thought he would like. They walked in the evenings along the edge of town, where the Texas sky was doing what it always did, which was perform its indifference to human concern in colors so extraordinary that the indifference became a kind of companionship. In the spring of 1884, Inez discovered she was expecting. She told Isaiah on a Thursday evening, sitting on the porch of the house on the east side of Redemption, with the pecan trees leafing out and the last of the sunlight going orange over the flats. She simply said it because she was a person who believed in saying true things plainly. "I think we are going to have a child." Isaiah sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before and which she would later describe to Clara Vasquez as the look of a man who has just been given something so large he is still calculating its dimensions. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am quite certain," she said. "I have confirmed it with the doctor." He reached over and took her hand, holding it in both of his in the careful way he had when he was feeling something too big to express in his usual measured terms. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Somewhat sick in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise extremely well." "Good," he said. "That is good." They sat on the porch as the evening came down around them, and he held her hand, and neither of them said anything for a while, but the silence was full of everything. Their son was born in November of 1884. They named him Samuel, after Inez's father, whose full name had been Samuel Crawford, and he arrived in the world with a considerable amount of dark hair and the disposition of someone who has opinions and intends to express them, which Inez observed to Isaiah within the first 12 hours, and Isaiah responded to by saying, entirely seriously, "He is exactly like you," which was the greatest compliment he could give. Samuel was healthy and loud and demanding and wonderful, and he reorganized the house on the east side of Redemption around himself with the complete confidence of a person who has no reason to doubt his welcome. He was passed between Inez and Isaiah and Mrs. Garfield, who had become a fixture in their lives by this point, and who treated Samuel with the devoted attentiveness of a grandmother, with Clara Vasquez filling the role of fond aunt. Having Samuel changed things, as having a child always does. It added urgency and weight to everything, made the future more specific, made the present more immediate. Inez found, to her own surprise, that motherhood did not diminish her professional ambitions, but rather sharpened them. She wanted the shop to succeed not just for herself now, but as a model for Samuel of what work done with skill and integrity looks like. Isaiah, for his part, began thinking seriously about land, whether they might eventually own rather than rent, whether there was a piece of Redemption they could put permanent roots into. By the spring of 1885, that thinking had become a plan. Martinez, the cattle broker Isaiah worked for, was aware of a parcel of land 3 miles east of Redemption that was coming available, 20 acres with a serviceable house and a small barn, priced reasonably, because the previous owner had moved north. Isaiah came home one evening and spread a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table and laid out the numbers with the careful precision he brought to all his accounting work, and Inez studied it alongside him, asking the specific questions she always asked, pressing on the assumptions to make sure they held. "What about the house?" she said. "Is it structurally sound?" "I walked through it with Martinez," he said. "The bones are good. The porch needs rebuilding and the kitchen needs work. Nothing that cannot be done. 20 acres is a working property," she said. "That changes the nature of what we are doing. Are you prepared for that?" "I was raised on a farm," he said. "I know what 20 acres requires." "You also left that farm," she said, not unkindly. He met her eyes. "I left my father's farm," he said. "That is a different thing from leaving a farm. I have wanted land of my own since I was 18 years old. This is a version of that." She looked at the map. She looked at the numbers. She looked at him. "Then let us buy it," she said. They bought it in June of 1885 and spent the summer making it livable, which was a project that revealed both the full extent of Isaiah's practical competence. He rebuilt the porch himself over 3 weekends, with James coming down from Missouri for one of them, and the full extent of Inez's determination to make wherever she lived precisely what she needed it to be. She redesigned the kitchen from the ground up, insisting on adequate light and counter space, and she planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that by late summer was producing tomatoes and beans, and the remarkable quantity of herbs she used in cooking. They moved in August, with Samuel now walking, unsteadily and with great enthusiasm, between the moving boxes, and Mrs. Garfield weeping again at the departure, and Clara and her husband helping with the furniture, and the whole community of small and important relationships that Inez and Isaiah had built in redemption turning out in the way that communities do when something of consequence is happening. On the evening of the move, when Samuel was asleep in his new room, and the kitchen was only partially organized, and the furniture was in various states of settled, Inez and Isaiah sat on the newly rebuilt porch in the summer dark and looked out at the 20 acres that were theirs, at the grass and the sky and the near stars. "I want to tell you something," Isaiah said. "Tell me," she said. "I want you to know that I understand what it cost you," he said. "The year of silence." "Not the silence you maintained, I understand that. I mean what it cost you underneath it, the fear you were managing. I have not said this clearly enough." She looked at him. "You do not need to." "I want to," he said, "because I think you have carried the weight of that year as though it was a failure, and I want to tell you that it was not. It was the way you survived something that frightened you, and you survived it, and here we are." She was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the Texas land went on around them: crickets, the distant movement of cattle on a neighbor's property, the wind in the pecan trees they had brought from the old house in a pot and planted by the new fence. "I was afraid," she said. "I have said that to you. But I think what I have not said is that what I was afraid of was not you leaving. I knew logically that you were not leaving me. What I was afraid of was needing you, allowing myself to need another person, and then having that person become unavailable in any of the 1,000 ways people become unavailable. I watched my father get smaller and smaller over 2 years before he died. He was available and then he was not, and no part of that process was anyone's fault or choice, and it destroyed me." "I know," Isaiah said. "I was protecting myself from the possibility of that," she said. "Which is, I understand now, not protection at all. It is just loneliness with a different name." "Yes," he said. "I would not go back to it," she said. "Even knowing what the year cost, I would not go back to the version of me that sent those letters back. That woman was managing her life instead of living it." "She was also remarkable," Isaiah said quietly. "Infuriating but remarkable." She laughed, which was still, 3 years into knowing him, one of the things she was most grateful to him for, that he could make her laugh genuinely, without trying, just by being honest. "I am glad the last letter was what it was," she said. "I am glad you said what you said in it. You told me a true thing in exactly the right way." "I was terrified to send it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it worked." He reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch of their house on the 20 acres east of Redemption, while the Texas night went enormous above them, and everything that had been unresolved was resolved, and everything that had been feared was faced, and the life they had built out of difficulty and distance and one last, desperate, true thing was entirely and completely theirs. The following years settled into the good rhythm of a life that has been deliberately constructed by two people who understand what they want and work together to maintain it. Isaiah expanded his work with Martinez into a partial partnership by 1886, managing a larger portfolio of cattle operations across the southern part of the county, and beginning to develop the reputation in the regional business community that his abilities had always warranted. Inez's dressmaking business grew steadily, and in 1887 she took on a young apprentice, a girl of 17 named Rosa Delgado, whose family had been in the region for 2 generations, and who had a gift for fine handwork and an eagerness to learn that reminded Inez pleasantly of herself at the same age. "You were never 17, Isaiah told her when she described Rosa to him one evening. "I was briefly," she said. It did not last long. He smiled at her over the top of his book. They had their second child in the spring of 1887, a girl this time, which delighted Samuel, who was 2.5 and had the strong opinion that a sibling was an excellent development. They named her Eleanor, after Isaiah's mother, who had died when he was 15, a woman he described, in the quiet way he described the things that mattered to him most, as the best person he had known before Inez and the most undervalued. "Isaiah Ellsworth," Inez said, holding her daughter on the afternoon of her birth, looking at the small face that was still figuring out what faces were for. "She will be ferocious." "She comes by it honestly," Isaiah said, sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand resting lightly on the blanket. "From you as much as from me," Inez said. He looked at her. "I am not ferocious," he said. "You are the quietest ferocious person I have ever met," she said. "It took me some time to identify it, but it is definitely there." He lifted Eleanor from her arms carefully and held her in the way he had held Samuel from the beginning, with total confidence and focus, and looked down at her and said, quietly enough that it was really for himself, "Hello, Eleanor. I am your father. I intend to be very present." Inez watched him say it and felt the full, accumulated weight of what they had, of what had almost not been, of the 12 letters and the year of fear and the 4-block walk in the October dark and the desk clerk who had given her a room number at 5 in the morning. And she let herself feel it entirely, without management or control, which was what she had learned in the end, was the only honest way to feel the things that mattered. The tin box was still under their bed. She had kept all 12 letters in it, including the one she had opened. She had read them all after they married, had sat one afternoon while Isaiah was at work and Samuel was sleeping, and she had opened each one carefully and read it in order, and it was one of the most painful and clarifying things she had ever done. The letters traced the arc of a man who had been faithful to her in the fullest sense of the word across a year in which she had given him nothing back. Faithful to what he felt and what he knew to be true about her and about them, even when she had provided him no reason to remain so. She had wept reading them too, not the same way she had wept over the 12th one, but quietly and with a great deal of gratitude and some measure of shame that she sat with rather than pushing away, because that was the honest thing to do. She had put them back in the tin box and kept them there, not as a reminder of failure, but as a record of something real, the evidence that love, in its truest form, is patient in the way that is not passivity but faithfulness. The evidence that some people, confronted with silence and distance, and the hidden motive of a fear they cannot see, choose to say the true thing one more time instead of giving up. James came to visit in the autumn of 1887, bringing with him a woman he was clearly courting, a practical and pleasant woman from his county in Missouri named Helen, who took one look at the farm east of Redemption and the running household and the 2 small children and said to Isaiah, with the directness of someone who is evaluating information rather than making conversation. "You found exactly what you were looking for." "I did," Isaiah said. "You did not find it where any of us expected," James said. "No one ever does," Inez said. She made dinner for the four of them on the evening of James's second day, the good kind of dinner that requires most of the day to prepare, and they sat at the table with the two children fed and bathed and put to bed, and the oil lamp warm above the table, and they talked about Missouri and Texas, and cattle prices and politics and books and the future, always the future, which was not frightening anymore but simply the continuation of what they were building. After James and Helen had gone to their room, Inez and Isaiah did the dishes together in the comfortable domestic rhythm they had developed, and Isaiah said, "James approves of you." "I know," she said. "I approve of him as well. He told me tonight while you were putting Alina down that you are the best thing that has happened to our family in 20 years, Isaiah said. She set down the dish she was drying and looked at him. "He said that." "He did. I told him he was correct." She resumed drying the dish. "Your family was due for something good," she said. "We were," he said. He handed her the next dish and his hand briefly covered hers as she took it. "We are." The winters in Redemption were mild enough that the outdoor work never entirely stopped, which suited Isaiah, who had discovered that he liked the combination of the office work with Martinez and the physical work of maintaining the 20 acres. He had put in a small orchard 5 peach trees and 3 apple trees along the west fence, and was attending to them with the patient, long-term thinking that fruit trees require, pruning and feeding and waiting, accepting that the real returns were 3 or 4 years off. Inez had pointed out that this was very characteristic of him. "I am a patient man," he said. "You are the most patient man I have ever met," she said. "It frightened me initially. I was not used to it." "What did you think patience meant?" he asked. "I thought it meant you were concealing something," she said. "In my experience, men who did not press for things they wanted were either not interested or had hidden motives." "And now," he said, "and now I understand that some people are simply patient," she said, "that it is a character trait rather than a strategy." "Only some people," he said. "You are singular in several respects," she said dryly, and he was still smiling about that when he went out to the orchard. In the spring of 1889, when Samuel was 4 and Alina was nearly 2, something happened that required the kind of courage Inez had once doubted she possessed in her personal life, but which she had always had in full in her professional one. A new dressmaker arrived in Redemption. His name was Gerald Porter, and he was originally from St. Louis, and he was competent and well capitalized, and he set up a shop directly across the street from Inez's and priced his work aggressively. And within a month he had attracted several of her clients with the appeal of novelty and slightly lower prices. 3 of her regular clients transferred their business, including Mrs. Harwell, whose wedding dress commission Inez had been counting on for the summer. Inez was angry about it in the specific, productive way that she was angry about most things, which is to say, she used the anger as fuel rather than dwelling in it. She analyzed why clients had left. It was not the quality of her work, which was superior, but the pricing and the novelty, and she made adjustments. She added a line of ready-to-alter dresses that could be done more quickly and cheaply. She accepted a commission from the local school to make costumes for a theatrical production, and she had Rosa begin working on a display window that would demonstrate the range and quality of what they produced. She did not badmouth Porter or complain to anyone about his arrival. She simply made her work so obviously excellent that the question of competition became somewhat beside the point. Within 4 months she had replaced the lost clients and added 2 new ones, including a woman who had tried Porter first and came to Inez specifically because, as she said, "His stitching is not as fine as yours and I should have started here." "Thank you," Inez said. "You are too modest about your work," the woman said. "I am not modest about my work," Inez said. "I simply do not find it necessary to be loud about it." Isaiah, hearing this account that evening, said, You are also the most patient, ferocious person I know. She looked at him. Did you just use my own words on me? You taught me the observation, he said. I am applying it. By 1890, they had been in the house east of Redemption for 5 years, and in that time it had become so thoroughly theirs that it was impossible to imagine the land as it had been before them. The bare fence lines now grown with climbing roses Inez had planted, the orchard beginning to produce in earnest. The garden expanded every year, Samuel's height marks on the kitchen doorframe, Aliner's garden toys perpetually underfoot in the yard. Isaiah had bought out a portion of Martinez's business by this point and was operating as a junior partner in what was now called the Martinez and Ellsworth Cattle Brokerage. A name on the letterhead that Inez had pointed out was going to require either an amended partnership or a new sign, and which Isaiah had noted with the dry humor she had come to love, meant he was finally in a position to need business cards. She designed them herself, because she had excellent taste and he knew it. They had their third child in the summer of 1890, another boy, born in July, with Isaiah's dark hair and Inez's green eyes, an improbable combination that produced a child of remarkable appearance and, at 8 months, considerable personality. They named him Daniel, partly because it was a strong name and partly because it had been the name of Isaiah's one close friend on the cattle trails, a man who had died of a fever in 1881 and whom Isaiah had never properly mourned, and naming a child after him seemed like the kind of healing that can only be accomplished through exactly this kind of continuity. Samuel took his role as eldest sibling with enormous seriousness, and Aliner took her role as middle child with the creative independence that middle children seem to generate as a matter of survival, and Daniel took his role as youngest with the cheerful supremacy of someone who has arrived into a household already organized around the well-being of small people, and has no complaints about this arrangement. The household was loud and full and occasionally chaotic in the ways that households with 3 young children are chaotic, and it was also, underneath all of that, deeply and fundamentally good. Inez thought about this sometimes, about the specific quality of the life they had made, and she could trace its architecture precisely. Built on honesty, on patience, on the willingness to say true things plainly even when it was frightening, on the refusal of both of them to let pride be more important than love. She thought about the letters sometimes too. She thought about how close she had come to the version of the story where she sent back the 12th one along with all the others, where she woke up on the Wednesday morning and put it in the return post before she had let herself feel anything. That version of the story was so plausible that it gave her something like vertigo when she considered it. One evening in the autumn of 1890, when the 3 children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the particular complete way it is quiet when children who have been loud all day finally surrender to sleep, she went and got the tin box from under the bed. She carried it to the kitchen where Isaiah was sitting with his accounts and his ledger book, and she put it on the table. He looked at it and then at her. I have been thinking, she said, sitting down across from him, that these should not live under the bed any more. What would you like to do with them? He said. She lifted the lid. The 12 letters were there, tied with a ribbon she had added, all still intact. She picked up the 12th one, the last one, the one that had made her walk 4 blocks in the October dark, and she held it for a moment. I want to keep them somewhere proper, she said. Not hidden. They are part of the story. The story, he said. Our story, she said. The real one with all its difficulties included. I do not want to pretend the year of silence was not part of it, because it was. It is why the last letter mattered. It could not have been what it was if the 11 before it had not been what they were. Isaiah was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the attention he had always given her, the full and unhurried kind. Where would you keep them? He said. There is a cedar chest in the spare room, she said. I thought alongside your grandmother's ring box and my father's letters to me, the important things. He nodded slowly. Yes, he said. She tied the ribbon back around the stack of letters and held them in both hands for a moment. She looked at him across the kitchen table with its oil lamp and its ledger and the quiet nighttime house beyond it, the house they had built together, the life they had made from the difficult material of fear and distance and the particular bravery of saying true things when it might not be enough. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "Every single day," she said. "I am glad I opened it. The 12th one. I am glad that on that Tuesday in October, something in me was done with the armor, and I opened it instead of sending it back. I am glad I walked to the Miller Hotel in the dark. I am glad I knocked on your door. I am glad every morning when I wake up that I did not choose the version of the story where I did not do those things, where I was too afraid to let something real happen to me. I am glad every single day." Isaiah Ellsworth set down his pen. He looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the lamplight, at the woman he had loved since before he had the word for it, and he said simply, "I know. I am too." She reached across the table and put her hand in his, and he held it the way he always held it, carefully and completely. And outside the house the Texas night went on in its beautiful, indifferent way, and the three children slept and the orchard stood in the dark, and the story that had begun in a narrow dress shop in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, was not a story about letters sent and returned. It was a story about a woman who was brave enough in the end to open the last one. Rosa Delgado finished her apprenticeship in 1891 and opened her own small tailoring shop in a town 12 miles east of Redemption, and Inez attended the opening with a leaner perched on her hip and a gift of the finest sewing scissors available in Redemption wrapped in paper she had cut herself. And she told Rosa, standing in the new shop that smelled of fresh wood and sizing, "Your work will speak for you. Keep the seams clean and the prices honest, and let the work do what it is supposed to do." "That is exactly what you always told me," Rosa said. "It is the only advice worth giving," Inez said. Isaiah had come along with Samuel and Daniel, and he stood near the door of the new shop looking at Inez as she spoke with Rosa, with the expression she had catalogued now across nearly a decade of marriage and still found each time to be the most extraordinary thing, the expression of a man who sees someone and knows what he is seeing completely without needing to translate it into anything else. She saw him looking. She raised an eyebrow. He smiled. Samuel tugged at his hand, wanting to be outside. The drive home in the wagon in the late afternoon was full, Samuel and Alina arguing companionably about something neither of them would later be able to identify. Daniel asleep against Inez's side with the total confidence of a 2-year-old who has never had a reason to doubt that the world is safe. The autumn light going gold and long across the Texas plain, the 20 acres appearing ahead of them with the peach trees bare-limbed and the house solid and lit in the early evening dark. Isaiah pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the gate, and they all got down in the usual organized chaos of family arrival, children dispersing in multiple directions, the horse needing attending, the day's wait setting down around the simple domestic business of coming home. And Inez stood at the gate for a moment watching it all, the alive and specific reality of the life she had built, and felt the full dimension of her own happiness in a way that she had learned over the years not to fear. Happiness, she had learned, was not a trap. It was not a thing that drew disaster by being felt too fully. It was simply what it was, the ordinary and extraordinary result of two people who chose each other, who kept choosing each other, who told the truth even when it was frightening and read books on opposite sides of a table, and argued about Dickens and rebuilt porches and planted orchards, and named their children after the people they had loved and lost. She went through the gate and up the porch steps and into the kitchen to start supper, and Isaiah came in behind her a few minutes later from stabling the horse, and he came straight to the kitchen and found her at the stove and put his hands on her shoulders from behind, not for any reason, just because she was there and he was home. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. They made supper. The children came in and were washed and fed. The lamp was lit. The dishes were done in the easy collaboration of long practice. The children were put to bed in the procession of stories and water glasses, and the small negotiations of bedtime, Samuel requiring tonight that Daniel's blanket be tucked in a specific way that he had invented, and that Isaiah accomplished with perfect solemnity. When the house was finally quiet, Inez and Isaiah sat on the porch in the November dark, which was mild enough for sitting, the stars the kind of vast that only appears far from cities, and she leaned against his shoulder and thought about nothing specific, which was its own kind of luxury. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the first time I sat in your shop, the book I was reading." "Bleak House," she said immediately. "I was not reading it," he said. "I was looking at you over the top of it." She laughed. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "You never said anything," he said. "I was deciding what to do about it," she said. "What did you decide?" he said. She tilted her head and looked at him. "I decided," she said, "that there was something worth being careful about, that a man who sat quietly and read and did not perform for my attention was either genuinely the thing he appeared to be or the best actor I had encountered, and that it was worth waiting long enough to find out which." "And which was it?" he said. "The first one," she said. "Entirely the first one." He put his arm around her shoulders. She settled against his side. The night went on around them, enormous and quiet and full of stars, and the life they had built from the raw materials of two people's courage held them both inside it, complete and real and theirs. The cedar chest in the spare room held the letters for many years after that. Samuel found them once, at age 9, and brought the stack to Inez with the natural curiosity of a child who has found something interesting in a chest of important things. She sat him down at the kitchen table and told him the story, not the full version, he was 9, but a version that was honest in the way she had always been honest with her children, that sometimes people who love each other make mistakes born of fear, and that the thing which makes those mistakes survivable is the willingness of at least one person to be brave one more time. "Which one was brave?" Samuel asked. "Your father," she said. "He wrote the last letter when he had every reason not to. That was the bravest thing." Samuel considered this. "And you?" he said. "I opened it," she said. "That was mine." He nodded, processing it with the serious face he had inherited from Isaiah, and that looked so familiar on a 9-year-old that it undid her slightly. "Was it scary?" he asked. "Opening it?" "All of it," he said. "Loving someone." She looked at her son across the kitchen table, and she thought about standing on a train platform in Caldwell with her spine rigid and her chin up and the train pulling away. And she thought about a tin box under a bed in a boarding house in Redemption. And she thought about 4 blocks in the October dark, and she said honestly, "Yes, it was very scary. It is worth it." Samuel put the letters back carefully and tied the ribbon the way she had tied it, and carried the stack back to the cedar chest with the reverence of someone handling something important. And Inez watched him go and thought about her father, who had trusted her with everything entirely. And she was very glad that in the end, she had trusted Isaiah with the same. Isaiah came in from the yard 10 minutes later, dusty from the orchard work, and found her still sitting at the kitchen table with a look on her face that he recognized. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Samuel found the letters," she said. He sat down across from her. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "A version of it." "What did he think?" Isaiah said. "He wanted to know if love was scary," she said. Isaiah looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said yes," she said, "and worth it." He reached across the table and took her hand, and the October light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them. And in the cedar chest in the spare room, 12 letters tied with a ribbon sat alongside an old ring box, and a father's handwriting on yellowed paper. The evidence of everything that had mattered. The proof that the scariest version of something brave is also the most important kind. The Martinez and Ellsworth cattle brokerage continued to grow through the early 1890s, and Isaiah's reputation extended beyond Redemption to several of the surrounding counties, which brought him more work and more travel than he preferred, but which he managed with the same careful balance he applied to everything. Always home before the week was out, always present at the table. always returning from whatever work had taken him temporarily elsewhere, with the solidity of someone who has a reason for returning that is worth returning to. He went to Missouri once more in 1892 to settle a final piece of his father's estate that James had discovered in an old record box, a small parcel of land that had been overlooked in the original settlement and that now needed to be dealt with properly. He was gone 8 days. He wrote Inez a letter every 2 days, which she opened immediately upon receipt and read at the kitchen table with her coffee, and replied to by return post. The correspondence had a different quality from those other letters, those 12 sealed ones. It was easy and present and full of specific detail. The voice of a man talking to someone he knows is listening, which is, she thought, the best possible version of any communication. When he came home, she was on the porch with Daniel, who was now 2, and Alina, who was 5, and they came down the porch steps to meet the wagon. And he got down from the seat and picked up Daniel and swung him up, and Daniel shrieked with delight. And Alina took his hand with the proprietary confidence of a middle child who is very certain of her place. And Isaiah looked across their heads at Inez, and the expression on his face was the one that still rearranged something in her interior landscape. The one that had been doing so since April of 1882. 8 days, she said. 8 days, he agreed. I brought Daniel a carved horse from a man in Bridgewater who makes them, and Alina does not require things brought from elsewhere, Alina said with the authority of 5. Alina requires you to be home. Isaiah looked down at his daughter. Inez watched him trying not to smile. Is that so? He said. Yes, Alina said, entirely certain. Then I am home, he said. He was home. He was always home in all the ways that word meant something. Inez had spent years building a life that was sufficient unto itself, a life that did not require anyone, and she had built that life so carefully and defended it so thoroughly that she had nearly missed the other life, the one that required a person specifically and was made richer and more real by the requiring. There was no version of this life, she understood now, standing on the porch of the house east of Redemption with the pecan trees and the orchard and the children and the cedar chest in the spare room, and the man coming up the porch steps with Daniel on his arm and Alina's hand in his, that had not depended on that last letter. On the truest thing he knew about himself, written on the 4th page, offered without guarantee, sent into a silence that had received only returns. She did not believe in fate as a mechanism. She believed in choices. In the accumulated weight of small choices made by people who are trying to be honest with themselves and with each other, and in how those choices build or fail to build the things worth having. He had chosen to write one more letter when 11 unanswered ones had given him every reasonable justification to stop. That was his choice. She had chosen to open it. That was hers. The rest was what they had built together from those 2 choices. The house, the farm, the children, the ordinary days and the important ones. The arguments about Dickens that were still happening in 1892 with the same quality they had had in 1882 in a narrow shop in Caldwell, which is to say with complete engagement and mutual delight, and the genuine exchange of people who are thinking rather than performing. On the last evening of 1892, with Samuel in bed and Alina not quite asleep, and Daniel entirely asleep across Isaiah's lap in the sitting room, with the year going out, and the new one coming in with no particular ceremony beyond the awareness of its arrival, Inez looked at her husband and thought about the first letter she had sent back. She thought about the line she had written on the outside, the single flat line. There is nothing between us, and she thought about how wrong it had been, how spectacularly and entirely wrong, and how glad she was that it had been wrong. There was everything between them. There had been everything between them since the 4th morning in the dress shop in Caldwell, Kansas, when a man she had not yet let herself love had sat reading Dickens on the far side of the room, and she had argued with him about sentimentality, and he had looked at her over the top of the book with those dark eyes paying full attention, and she had thought, This is either the thing I have been afraid of, or it is the thing I have been waiting for. It was both. It had always been both. She reached over and put her hand on his arm gently, so as not to wake Daniel sleeping across his lap, and he looked at her and she said, "Happy New Year, Isaiah." And he said, "Happy New Year, Inez." And his voice was exactly what it had always been, plain and honest and containing, in the simple sound of her name, everything he had ever meant and everything he still meant, and everything he intended to go on meaning for as long as it was given to him to mean anything. Outside the house east of Redemption, the Texas winter night was cold and clear, and the stars were the kind of extraordinary that never stops being extraordinary no matter how many years you have lived under them. And the new year arrived quietly over the 20 acres and the orchard and the pecan trees, over the cedar chest in the spare room and the letters tied with a ribbon inside it, over the house and the family and the life that had been built from the only foundation that holds anything for long. The willingness to say the true thing plainly, even when you are afraid, especially when you are afraid, and to believe that on the other side of the silence, someone who loves you is finally ready to hear it.